Welcome to the era of good feelings, 1815 to 1825. This is in some ways kind of a strange period in American history. Things feel good, that's why they call it the era of good feelings, and we have to ask ourselves the question, why would you get this weird name, the era of good feelings? What about it made it feel good? Well, the first part of it is we have this president that we don't talk about a whole lot, which is James Monroe, the fifth president of the United States. What happens is essentially the country goes to only one party. There's a breakdown of the two-party system, and essentially everyone is a Democratic Republican. And so political differences fade away, people aren't fighting about things all the time. There's this increasing sense of nationalism, especially coming out of the War of 1812. And so there's trust in the government, there's just less political fighting. Of course, as we know, thinking logically, this is not going to last. Now, James Monroe is also seen in the Crossing the Delaware painting that's quite famous. Now, most people don't pick up on the fact that, hey, that's James Monroe. They're focused entirely on George Washington and the story of crossing the Delaware and the resulting Battle of Trenton. But Monroe is the one holding the flag. And so as part of this, the era of good feelings, you have something called the American system, which is proposed by Henry Clay. And Henry Clay, you're going to talk about a fair amount in U.S. history because he gets this nickname, this strange nickname, the Great Compromiser. Why do we call him that? Because Henry Clay comes up with several compromises. The Missouri Compromise in 1820, another two compromises that help prevent and kind of extend out this window of fighting the American Civil War. So Henry Clay's compromises help with that, but Henry Clay's other contribution is the American system. His idea is that he wants to make the U.S. self-sufficient, and he wants infrastructure built from the National Road that you're seeing in the image to canals, such as the Erie Canal that we're about to talk about. In addition, he wants a protective tariff to help American business, industry. Now, do remember that most of this industry is going to be in the north, and specifically the northeast. And that's going to become a bit of an issue because there's less of it in the south, and we'll talk more about that. The National Bank, meanwhile, has the goal of promoting a single national currency. And so all these are parts of the American system that Clay is trying to see implemented. And so the first national bank had expired, and now here is the second national bank. And so state banks made too many loans and put too much money in circulation. That had led to inflation. And so they're recreating the second national bank, which is today in Philadelphia. And so this is the bank today, if you look at it. And obviously, in looking at it today, you can kind of tell something about the second national bank. Really, nothing happens here. This is not a building that people work in. It's something of a little bit of a museum. It's not really taken care of. It hasn't held up. And so the Second National Bank is not going to survive as well. But they're going to create it for the time being. And we're going to be talking more about that Second National Bank. So keep this in mind. This is not far from Independence Hall. It's just around the corner. Internal improvements. Between 1825 to 1850 gets referred to as the Age of Canals. This allowed farmers in these regions to basically take their goods and flow them east to where the population centers were. And it allows manufactured goods to go west. The importance of a canal is that a canal is kind of a fake man-made river. And what it allows you to do is move all these goods by water. Moving goods by water is much cheaper than any other form of transportation. And so this is able to take a lot of the farmland that's out in the west and basically connect it to the big population centers of the east. Now you're not having to ship everything down the Mississippi and around Florida and up the coast. Now you can simply move it over. And so the biggest of these will be quite famously the Erie Canal up here at the top. And the Erie Canal connects New York City basically to the Hudson River, to the canal, which connects the entirety of the Great Lakes all the way on through to New York. And that meant that if you're in Chicago, you can put something out on the Great Lakes and then snake it through to the canal and send it down to New York City. And so this had tremendous economic benefits. New York City is going to explode population-wise, take off as a result. And so this canal, there's kind of old sayings about it that basically said there's one dead Irishman for every mile of the Erie Canal, because a lot of people did die in the construction using TNT, dynamite, and kind of blowing the ground up and getting it ready to create this canal. And so it creates a navigable water route from New York to the Great Lakes. And again, as we've stated, water transport is the cheapest form of shipping. So again, you can kind of see all the cities that are along the Great Lakes. Again, we're only showing you American cities. Up here on Lake Ontario is where you have Toronto. And so this is what a canal looks like. This is kind of a side view of the Panama Canal. And again, what a canal really functions as is it's a water elevator. If you are to create this fake river, okay, over the land, the problem is that the land is not flat. Houston is flat. It's incredibly flat overall, but even Houston has some slope. Most places have hills and kind of mountains, etc. And so in a good canal, you are essentially able to lift that boat using these different water elevators, these locks, okay, through the canal. And so water is basically, you move into each lock, the door's shut, the water is either raised to boost you up to the next height, or it's lowered to basically drop you down. And there's valves at the bottom that kind of release and pull that water in and out. So here is a picture of the Erie Canal today. And again, the Erie Canal much of it is no longer in like a usable state, and it's largely not used at all today. But the Erie Canal was a big thing back at this time. Here's another picture of it at the time, kind of much closer to its birth and its use. And again, you can see the locks right here. In addition, as part of the American system, they have something called the protective tariff. At this point in time, Great Britain is the industrial leader of the world, and America is desperately trying to compete with Great Britain. And so the protective tariff was intended to help this kind of new, vulnerable American industry that existed in the American Northeast, not the South. And so it made goods from Great Britain more expensive, and it allowed American goods as a result to compete price-wise. Well, there's a problem. This benefits the North, but the South has very little industry. The South has to buy a lot of their things from Great Britain and other places. And so the Southerners are having to pay more for those goods, but also they're seeing that this tariff not only hurts them from buying things from that standpoint, it benefits the North. And so this whole tariff issue is going to become an ongoing issue with the North and the South. And in fact, 40, 50 years later, you're actually going to see this as a cause of the American Civil War. And so people will debate to the extent to which it was a cause, but tariffs help the North and they hurt the South. And finally, what we get to is the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819. This is otherwise sometimes known as the Florida Purchase Treaty. Andrew Jackson invades Florida to stop Seminole raids into American territory. Well, who in the heck are the Seminole is a very good question. The Seminole are a group of different Native American tribes, but they include many escaped slaves. And so you have slaves that are escaping the American South and fleeing over into Spanish territory, which is Florida. And while they're there, in Spanish territory, this causes a lot of frustration for slave owners in the American South. Additionally, there are some raids that go back across the border into the United States. And so not long after the War of 1812 and Jackson's becoming a hero in 1815 at the Battle of New Orleans, Jackson is leading these raids down into Florida against the Seminole. There's going to be 3 Seminole Wars in American history. This is the first. It's the only one that Jackson participates in. But he's going to seize Spanish forts, creating big international issues. Spain isn't really very present in Florida at this time. And so they're not going to push back a whole lot. And the Secretary of State at the time, John Quincy Adams, will negotiate the terms of the treaty. Spain is going to give up Florida to the United States. In the process, the U.S. will essentially acknowledge the boundaries of Texas. In addition, Spain will give up their claim on the Oregon country at the top. But far and away the biggest part of all of this is that this is where we get Florida. But I want you to keep in mind that the Seminole raids were in many ways about escaping slaves into Florida, and they're trying to close that off. Now, once Florida's closed off, if you're a slave and you need to get out of the country, quite often the fastest, easiest way to do it was to get to Canada now, a much harder route, and we're going to talk about that further in American history. And so, in addition to Florida really having this slave thing that we don't talk about a whole lot, this whole issue of the expansion of slavery into new Western territory is also going to become a huge American issue. And so, as the country expands west through the Louisiana Purchase, new states that get admitted, and specifically this one is going to be Missouri as the first one, they're going to try to figure out, is this new state going to be slave or free? Missouri, in the Compromise of 1820, will be admitted as a slave state. In order to keep the balance of free and slave states, they're going to admit Maine up here at the top right, which had been part of Massachusetts. They're going to admit Maine as that free state. And so they're trying to maintain that balance. You need to ask yourself the question at this point, what happens when they can no longer maintain the balance of free and slave states? What happens then? And also as part of this compromise, you get this compromise line, above which the 36-degree parallel, slavery will not be allowed. Beneath it, slavery will be. Now think of this too from a slavery perspective. If you're somebody who wants to see the extension of slavery, there's not much more territory over here to expand into. Over here, you have the potential for a lot more free states. So again, kind of a bigger look at the map. Pause it and take a look at it if you want to inspect it further. Okay, another view. Okay, and finally, in the early 1800s, European nations planned to help Spain and Portugal regain rebelling colonies. American leaders feared that their government and economy would be in danger. And so what follows is we have this fear of the Europeans coming back to the Americas, North and South America. We create something called the Monroe Doctrine. And President Monroe will warn Europeans to stay out of the Western Hemisphere, that this is our area of influence. We say in return, we will stay out of European affairs. Now, at this time, could we really stop the Europeans from coming into the American Hemisphere? And the answer is no. We really can't. We're still not militarily mature enough to do that. But the Monroe Doctrine we study because we use it still to this day. And so you'll see it over here. Here's the United States, okay, kind of protecting kind of the Americas from the Europeans. Okay, another image. Okay, Uncle Sam in the center. Okay, and again, all kind of the countries of the Americas. Okay, and Uncle Sam is kind of taking care of the different countries of the Americas. Okay, another view, Uncle Sam spanning the entirety of the Americas, carrying a big stick. Okay, and later on, the Monroe Doctrine becomes a huge thing in the Spanish-American War of 1898. Okay, because Spain does try and it does misbehave according to American opinion. And so here's Teddy Roosevelt with the Monroe Doctrine. And then here's the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1963, when the Soviet Union, now Russia, basically put nuclear missiles on the island of Cuba. And so we invoked the Monroe Doctrine. We said, hey, you guys can't be over here. And so we still use the Monroe Doctrine to this day. And President Kennedy addressing the nation during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest we've ever come to all-out nuclear war.